A new series on the Kepler Electronics YouTube channel, and you might be asking yourself, what is this? This doesn't look like anything that you normally do. Well, yes, if you're new to the channel, I mostly do robotics videos, but I have other hobbies as well, such as developing video games. And recently, I have been really liking Pico 8. And what Pico 8 is it is a little a program that you buy. It's about $15. It's pretty inexpensive for what you get. That basically emulates the limitations of an old retro home computer video game console. It's got a certain amount of space, and everything you add takes up space. It's got integrated sprite editor, integrated map editor, integrated sound effects and music editors, and you can play other people's games and even look at the source code. So what I plan on doing with the series is kind of doing a video journal, if you will, of where I've come and where I'm going with programming. I'm no expert programmer. I am very, very not great at programming, but I'm trying to get better. And I like video games, and video games are a fun way to kind of learn to program. So that's what we're going to be doing. And I'm going to be walking through my code and just kind of showing you here's where it is, and then after a couple of weeks or months or however long it takes me to get to the next sort of time where I feel, okay, yeah, I can make another video. I've changed enough. Then I'll make another video and say, hey, I've changed some stuff. Here's what I've changed. Here's why I've changed it. And so that's how this is going to work. But you might be asking yourself, well, what are you even making? Well, if I run the game, I'm making a game called Gravitas. It is a Space Invaders Galaxian sort of clone. But there's some cool things that I think will kind of make it different enough that it's very interesting. So right now there's some glitches, like I've been trying to implement a shop system with the coins that you collect, and it's not exactly liking respawning the enemies. But as you can see, every time I shoot an enemy, my score increases. Every time I collect a coin, my coin counter increases. Every time, well, you can't see it now, but every time I shoot all 3 enemies, I guess actually it does work right now, the wave counter increases. And if I get hit, let's see if I can actually get hit. Too slow for that one. I lose a life, and a little explosion animation plays. So this is going to be segmented just because it's easier for me to record, and that way if I mess up, then I don't have to start over. This first video is going to be probably pretty long because I'm going to be kind of going through the code and how everything works. And but the next episodes should be pretty simple because I'm just going to be talking about what I've changed. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into the code. Now you can see here that we're in the first tab, variables and main functions. Well, what Pico 8 does is it has the update functions, update and update 60. If you do update 60, it updates the screen 60 times a second for 60 FPS. And it's got underscore draw, which is essentially draws everything on the screen, which is pretty nice. That way you don't have to kind of set up your own things. So the way I have it set up is I have my sort of global variables set up at the top. So my score, my money, my wave counters, those are all pretty self-explanatory. Then I have shop time and game time. If shop time is true, then the shop is active, and if game time is true, then you're actually shooting and dodging bullets and stuff. If game start is true, as it is at the start of a game, then it will draw the title screen and the sort of logic that goes along with that. And if end game is true, that means that the game over screen is present, and if you hit X, then you get to move on, and it will basically just respawn you. I might want to make it so that it kicks you back to the main menu, but I haven't set that up yet. So let's get into update 60. So the way it works is if game time equals false, as it is at the beginning, then title screen and star spawn start. So star spawn is the function that draws all the stars. Title screen is the function that star spawn is the one that, generates the positions of the stars, not that actually draws the stars. And title screen is the one that does the logic of the title screen, which is basically just if you press X, then it goes. Then if game time equals true, if you're actually dodging bullets and stuff, then it does star spawn and mult spawn. Now mult spawn is essentially a function that generates the positions of coins. Why is it called mult spawn? Well, they used to be multipliers, as you would see in something like Geometry Wars, but when I realized that Pico 8 only has a 16-bit, it emulates a 16-bit system, which means that it can only go up to I can't remember off the top of my head if it's 16,000-ish or 32,000-ish, but it wasn't enough. And after like 3 waves, you would essentially overflow it, and it would wrap around to the negatives, and that wasn't great. So I decided to switch them over to coins, which I think is going to end up being a more interesting game anyway, so it kind of ended up being a blessing in disguise. So then if player dead equals false or mid-wave equals false, so if the player isn't dead or we're not in between waves, then do all of the logic dedicated to enemies and players and lasers and collision and all that good stuff. And then if shop time equals true, then do the shop logic. Then we get to draw. Now then with draw, it will clear the screen, and that's important because if that's not there, then you end up getting these trails and every pixel of the screen is just a mess and it's not good to look at. And we also have player explosion. So if the player explodes, if the player dies, then we'll always have the explosion, whether or not any other factors are present, which is kind of a good thing. And if game start is true, then draw the titles and draw the stars. If game time is true, then draw everything. And the shop is included in there because it's kind of you have to have the game running for the shop to be a thing. Then if animation done is true, so if the player's explosion animation is done, and if player lives are less than or equal to 0, just preventing any weird glitches where it goes like -1 if 2 bullets happen to hit the player at the same time, then it will clear the screen, do game over, and end game is true, so that if the player hits X, they will restart the game. And that's essentially the variables and main functions tab. So I will take it over, I'll give it over to my future self, and we will go over the create object functions tab. Okay, so now we're on the create object functions, and what this tab does is it essentially draws in the coins and the stars, and does all of the logic and stuff relating to those. Excuse me. Okay. So, welcome to the Create Object Functions tab. What this is it is a tab that holds all of the stuff for creating the coins and the stars, and drawing them and everything related to them. So, the code here was created by Davbo, much thanks to him, and edited by me, because there were some things that I wanted to edit so that there were different conditions for spawning and stuff. But essentially, I had help basically like before I did anything else on this project. I asked on the forum, the Pico 8 forum, link in the description to the Pico 8 forum, for help, and he graciously offered to help because I really stink when it comes to tables and all of that good stuff. So without further ado, let's get into it. The way it starts off is you have an empty table for the stars and the multipliers. So this holds all of the stars and the coins, which I am going to change this because multipliers, as I said before, are now coins. I just need to go through and change the names, but I have been too lazy to right now. So now we have the coins, which essentially is just the number of coins that you have in your inventory. Then we get to create mult, which creates an X and a Y value for each coin, and then adds it to a table, and then adds that table to the malts table, to the coins table. And that's basically all that's in that function. Once we get to the draw coin function, it will draw each coin. That's essentially all you need to know. For each malt in the malts tab, malts table, it will create a malt. I'm just going to refer to them as malts because it's easier for me. And then this is malt spawn. So if an enemy dies, it will turn on malt 1, and it will create a malt at the enemy's X position and 10, which is what all enemies are at for their Y position. Do that for all 3 enemies, because the enemies are not in a table, which should tell you something about how skilled I am with tables. But that's on the list of things to do. And then, for each malt, move the malt down the screen, y equals y plus 1, and if it equals 128, then delete it. Otherwise, it will fill up and essentially add all of the points, the coordinates will be stuck in the memory, and we'd get a ton of lag, which is not great. So we delete them so that it doesn't overflow. Not overflow, but so that it doesn't fill up RAM, the self-imposed RAM limit of Pico 8. And if malt y equals player y, then this was for testing. I don't really need that anymore, and it also doesn't print, and I don't know why. But if malt x equals player x plus or minus 10, then it will add money to the player, and it will also delete the malt. So if y equals player y, then check if x equals to player x, and if it does, then add money. It is the literal exact same thing for stars, except that we create the stars at a random x value. We create the stars at a random x value. Every few frames. I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, and I don't remember how to calculate it. So, yes, essentially, this increments itself, and on 0, 5, and 10, it will create a star. Any less than that, then it will stop. I kind of want to make it do less stars, because it's kind of, it's maybe and probably is way too many stars. But yeah, so essentially that is how the star and coin creation functions work. Okay, this brings us to the third tab, the player. And we have our player variables up at the top. Is the player dead? Player's X position, the player's Y position, which isn't really used right now. It's always at 120. But in case I wanted to do anything fancy, like at the beginning of the game, the player flies onto the screen, I could do something like that. Then we get to the player control function. So if the player's dead, or if the player is not dead, excuse me, then it checks to see, is the player still on the screen? Yes. And if it is, then it will let the player move, and this symbol right here is just a capital R. There are really no capitals. Each capital letter is just kind of a different symbol. So then we do player X equals player X plus 1. If the player is still on screen, then let them move in the other direction. And if X, then we have a very, very kind of convoluted system, but it makes sense and it works, so that's all that really matters. So if the player presses X, the system checks to see if laser 1, 2, or 3 equals false. If laser 1 is false, then it will create a laser at the player's coordinates and turn laser 1 to true, which then sets off all of the laser's movement stuff. And if laser 2 is, and it does the same for laser 2 and laser 3. That's basically all we have for the player tab. But I'll go on to the enemies tab. So we start off with is the enemy alive? Yes. Is the enemy dead? Yes, which I don't really need both of these, but I believe this one is used in the explosions, so right now we're gonna leave it. We have the enemy expositions as they start, because every time they die and get respawned, they respawn at a random X location. So if the enemies exist, draw them. That's the function enemy spawn. That's basically what it is. Then we have enemy right equals true, enemy left equals true. I definitely don't need both of these, and so that's something we can consolidate. And then we have enemy move C. So basically, every 16 frames, if my math, like, probably at midnight a month and a half ago, if that math holds up, then every 16 frames the enemies will move. And so essentially it's just a counter that increments itself. If it equals 41, then it resets itself back to 0. And basically, if enemy move C equals 40, then if enemy right equals true, so if the enemies are moving right, then it will move all 3 enemies right. If the enemy left is true, if the enemies are moving left, then it will move the enemies left. It's pretty self-explanatory. Then we get to enemy switch, which basically, if any of the enemies, if enemy 1, 2, or 3 touches the edge of the screen, then make them move to the opposite edge. It trips a switch, so that if any of them touch one side of the screen, then it will move all of them to the other side of the screen. And the same for the left side. And then we get to the enemy laser stuff, which, so, has the enemy fired their laser? No. Then we start with enemy laser X and enemy laser Y, which are done off the screen, basically just so that it can always draw it, which is not a great thing, and I should probably change that, but that's the way it is right now. We have a counter to determine if the laser will be fired. So essentially, and laser intensity, which both of these work hand in hand with this one line of code right here. So laser C equals a random integer with a maximum of Li. So Li starts out at 300. And we get to the point where every time a new wave goes, we end up with -10. So wave 2, it's 290. So essentially, you start off with a 3 in 300 chance or a 1 in 100 chance of an enemy firing every frame. As time goes on, it gets less and it gets less, which makes surviving theoretically more difficult, even though it really shouldn't be that much more difficult. So if the player is not dead, and if enemy 1 is alive, then if the laser counter equals the number that I have decided on for enemy 1, then create a laser at the enemy's position and make it true. The same for enemy 2, the same for enemy 3. And if enemy laser equals true, then make the laser move down the screen at 2 pixels a second, just because that's fast and 1 pixel was way too slow. If the laser equals 128, then it doesn't exist anymore. And set the laser to false and set the Y position back to 10. And that is essentially how the enemies work. Hello there and welcome to the Collision tab. What this tab holds is essentially all of the things relating to collision, which the name implies. So we have our laser, are the lasers active, Boolean variables? Yes, those are Boolean variables. Got worried for a second there. We have are the lasers active variables right there. And then we have our laser X coordinates. We just initialize them outside of any functions so that they can be searched through by all functions. So we don't get any searching for a local variable in a function that the variable was not declared in. It just helps with some of these things. So you get to the laser tab. If the lasers are active, then move them up the screen. If the player's lasers are active, I should clarify. Then if the lasers move off the screen, then allow the player to fire again. That's essentially how that works. We get to coins, so all of the coins, these don't belong here at all. They should really be in create object functions, but I never said this was super well organized. I said it was organized in the fact that these kind of belong here, but they would fit a lot better in create object functions. So we get to laser collision, which what laser collision is essentially if any of the laser positions equal the enemy Y position. If any of the Y positions equal the enemy Y position, then if enemy 1 is alive, then check to see if any of the laser X positions are within about a 2 pixel window, 5 pixel window, 2 on either side, and then the one that's directly in the center of the enemy. And then we turn the enemy to false, create a multiplier, aka a coin, at that position, add 100 to the score, and say the enemy is dead, which means that we will then draw the explosion animation. We do that for all 3 enemies and all three lasers. This does have the unfortunate side effect, which I will. This code is a mess, but essentially what happens is laser 1Y equals 10. Well, then it will run the code for laser 2. And so if laser 1Y equals 10 and laser 2X is within the acceptable range of X positions, even though these are not the same laser, it will still kill the enemy, which is not good. But essentially I just have to basically rewrite this code, kind of shuffle some of these variables around a bit. Maybe check the enemy before I check the Y values, because then I can check, see here's laser 1, then I just check all, if laser 1Y is the same. It's just a thing. But then again, if I rewrite the laser and enemy codes to allow for to be in tables, then I don't have that. I'm basically gonna have to completely rewrite this anyway. But yeah, so it does that for all 3 enemies, and we get to the player collision. If the enemy 1 laser Y equals player Y, then if enemy 1 laser X is player equals player X, or player X plus 1, or player X minus 1. I was having a lot of problems with this. I should really make this a window. Collision's very hit or miss on the player right now. I should probably change that, and I will change that by next time. I can guarantee you that. Yeah, so it checks to see if the enemy lasers X and Y positions equal the players, roughly. Then it will kill the player, reduce their lives, and once the player dead indicator is true, then it will play the animation, the explosion animation. And that is the collision tab. And now we get to the animation tab, the just absolutely worst, perhaps worse than the collision. Yes, this has, if we go into, where is it? Lines. This tab has 423 lines. If we compare that to the collision tab, that only has 126 lines. And we'll get to why this one has so many more lines than any other tab in a second. So we have laser draw, which is where it draws the lasers. Essentially, if the lasers exist, draw them. That's basically how most of this works. Indenting that so it fits. If the enemy lasers exist, draw them. Enemy count and player count. Essentially, what this is a counter that doesn't self-increment. It increments every time there's a frame. And since I was having trouble with the frames playing for as long as I wanted them to, I essentially just went through and played every single frame for every enemy. So If enemy count is 0 and if the enemy's dead and the enemy count is 0, then do sprite 19. If it's 1, sprite 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. That's like a 6-frame animation, which means that it takes roughly it takes exactly a tenth of a second, provided there's no lag, which is a short animation, and it does that for every enemy. Then we get to well, we have player draw, which is the player alive, draw them. We have animation done, which essentially, once the player dead animation is finished, it will draw the game over screen. And then we get to the most difficult, and this is sad to me, part of this code. We have the player count, and I could not get this to work for the life of me, so what I ended up doing is basically mapping out, I don't even remember how many it is, it's like exactly 100 frames. Excuse me. And it just goes through and shows the same frame for every single number. It shows a frame, increments it, shows a frame, increments it, shows a frame, increments it, and it just does that. And it's sad. It's sad. I need to go back through and fix this, because I could probably shave a lot off of my token count by just erasing a lot of this. But once it does 100, it will draw the final frame. It will say the animation is done. It will say the player is not dead and set player count to 0. So essentially, you can go on with your life. That is essentially how this works, and this is, I so need to go back through and fix this. I think I know how to do it. I was having trouble with it, and so I eventually just said, forget this, I'm going to just manually do this, which was a total waste of time, but it works. It works, and that's the important thing. So now we move on to menus and stuff. So we start off with a variable. Is it in between waves? No. Well, that's what it's supposed to be, because you don't start off the game in between waves. So we start off with wave counter, which kind of starts off the shop thing. If all 3 enemies are dead, then mid wave is true. It's between waves. If shop time is false, then increment waves. Shop done equals false, because you can't have shop time and shop done and shop time. So draw the shop. This is just for testing, and so is this. Then if shop done is true, then it decrease LI, which if you were paying attention earlier, it essentially makes the enemies more likely to fire. And then respawn the enemies at random X positions. +5 so that they start off of the left side of the screen, so they're not like hugging the left side of the screen, which would be bad, because essentially then the enemies could just keep moving off the left side of the screen, which is not great. And then shop down is false, so it kind of just it concludes this. Then we get to the top bar display, which is prints the score, the coins. I had to do 2 lines for this because you can't, because it would have taken up more space, because if I put a colon there, there's about 2 extra pixels of stuff that I don't want. There's about 2 extra pixels of space when I want 1 pixel instead of 3 pixels, essentially. So it just makes it conserve space, which, since there's so little space, it's good. It conserves space. It prints the wave and the wave counter, and it prints the player's lives. So if player lives are 3, then show 3 things. Player lives are 2, show 2. 1, show 1, etc. If you have game over, print the game over, which is actually held in the map screen. So that's all game over text. It's held in the map screen. It's just easier than having to draw call each individual sprite. Then print the score, the credits, which are money, and then ask if they want to try again. I might change this text. I probably will change this text because I'm not a huge fan of how it doesn't say press X, press any button to continue. So then, if endgame is true, which it should be if you're kind of doing this, if you're at the game over screen, endgame should be true. Then it will see if you press a button, it will like basically reset everything. Then select start is true, which the way I was gonna run it is there's gonna be select start, select whatever. Essentially, I don't need it because only one thing can be selected at a time on the title screen because there's not a like credits option or something. If you press a button, then start the game. That's essentially how it works. A lot of very self-explanatory things. Title draw the title, which is here. If I move over, you can see it's here. It's very big. Each of these is held up, is made up of like each letter is basically 2 sprites. Some of them are 4 sprites because they fall on a weird sprite boundary. Print begin adventure. Yeah. So basically draw everything in the title, and I don't know why there's such a huge gap here. But then we get to the shop logic, which is all commented out because there's nothing interesting there right now. Yeah, so that's basically how all this works. We're just gonna go into the things to do. So here's the things to do. I want to add a different shop system. I want to finish the shop system, excuse me, with different ships, extra weapons, more lasers on screen at once, because that's fun. I want to make enemies not spawn within 10 X coordinates of each other because they can sometimes spawn on top of each other and basically create like a weird amalgamation of 2 ships. I want to improve the player explosion because that is just a total mess. Fix collision with player because there's about a 3 pixel window that the laser can hit, which that needs to be a lot bigger. Fix the issue with enemy collision where X is lined up with one enemy and the Y of another, then both enemies die. I think it's only one enemy that dies. I don't know what I was thinking when I wrote that. Move lasers and enemies over to table. Add more enemies, and this is kind of a an offshoot of that. Possibly more enemy classes. I have another sprite that I'm sort of happy with. It's not the worst thing I've ever made. I like this one a lot better, but this one's cool too. It could present something nifty, but yeah, more enemies, more weapons. There's a potential other bullet. Yeah, so that's essentially how this works. This is what I have so far. It's not beautiful by any means, but it works somewhat. I kind of broke it when I tried to add in the shop system, but that'll be fixed by next time. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching. It's been a very, very, very thrown together video. But I thank you for sticking with me if you made it this far. Yeah, and I hope to have something pretty nice to show you for next time. Anyways, I'll see you later. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.